course, thank you all for coming this evening. I promise it's going to be a full feast of gingerbread. As we will learn, as I've recently learned in reading about Christopher Ludwick. Two qualifications. I'm not a baker. Daphne in the back is our resident baker general at the Franklin Fountain and Sheen Confectionery. And so she has cooked up some Christopher Ludwick inspired gingerbread cookies for you, some samples tonight, and then of course some that you can purchase to take home. They make wonderful gifts. I also do not speak German, so please correct me and help illuminate words that I cannot pronounce. I'm wondering first, what does this say, other than baker? Can anyone read that?
If I had flour and grains, then I could nourish myself better. But then the last line gets tricky. But is that really a bee?
The last word?
Yes.
Vida. Both. Vida. It's like a D.
It's the same. Yeah.
Yes, like he's combining it in his
So
bread.
all together.
Yes.
All that or both.
Sometimes knowing German doesn't help.
That's a lot more than I knew.
Old German's not the same as German.
But I thought there's no known image of Christopher Ludwick, which is sort of interesting. And if there is an image, please tell me about it. It seems kind of amazing that a man of such renown in his day and still today is a revolutionary hero. We don't know what he looked like. So I'm imagining this is him as an apprentice in his father's shop. Ludwig was born at Gießen. So some biographies say Greisen, with the only difference being, or Gießen being an R there, which really is extremely confusing, because that is in a different part of Germany.
Giessssen.
Yes. And this is indeed the town that he was born in 1720. His father had a bakery, so he grew up inhaling all of the ingredients that would make his livelihood. There was a university school there that is still there since the 17th century, and around the age of 14, after his apprenticeship with his father, he attended this school. So he was a learned man. The pretzel is the sign of bakeries. So probably many of these places make pretzels, as they say, but that is the trade symbol in Germany traditionally. His life was amazing. Truly, when I started really diving into this, it was overwhelming, frankly. I mean, he's like on a level with Benjamin Franklin, as far as he lived like three almost completely distinct lives, all of which seem kind of mind-blowing in and of themselves. So we'll just go through this first life as a military man. He enlists in the Austrian army, and he fights on the side of Austria that came to the aid of Russia in the Russo-Ottoman Wars of the middle century. So they're fighting the Turks on the Russian border in what is probably now what we would think as Hungary, that area. And in 1740, his compatriots in the army, there's 100 of them, and they are forced to leave where they're fighting and walk back to Vienna in the middle of the winter. And it was so cold, they walked 300 miles, and 100 out of 100 men, 25 survived. So Ludwick is one of these survivors. He hangs out in Vienna for a little while, and then he is either conscripted or joins the Prussian army. There are conflicting accounts of that. But he hasn't had enough of military life quite yet. So he's a young man, and he's fighting in Germany, and then I think he kind of gets sick of army life and decides to head over to London. And there was a lot of cross-pollination of what can we say, like commerce, trade between England and Germany during this period. A lot of Germans went over to England and worked. Exactly. There was intermarried between the royalty. So he goes over and immediately becomes the baker on a ship for the Royal Navy at the dock. And he travels around the world with the British Navy, doing what he knows best, baking. Bless you. And then after 3 years of that, he's got enough of military life, at least for a while. And he goes into the Merchant Marines and becomes part of the East India Company and travels the triangular trade routes between Europe, the Caribbean, and North America, trading all kinds of things. Sugar, spices from the East. I'm sure that he was involved on ships that had slaves, and that's how he stops by Philadelphia on one of these commercial voyages as a merchant marine. He stops in Philly and he realizes that there is a lot of opportunity. Now keep in mind, he's a little younger than Benjamin Franklin. So he's not quite a contemporary, but he's close. And he's older than most of the founding fathers in America. So just kind of keep that in mind as far as where he is in his life. At this point, he's young 30s. He's had a lot of experience around the world. He's got this apprenticeship under his belt, and he sees this incredible opportunity in Philadelphia, right as Philadelphia is reaching the pinnacle of our status as the colonial capital. By the 1760s, Philadelphia was the top place in North America for trade, for politics. But he doesn't stay. He's on this merchant marine voyage. So he actually goes back to London. Now this is a building that he would have seen at Front and Market Streets in Philadelphia. London Coffee House. He goes back to London and he buys, it's sort of weird, like I had to read this 3 times. He buys a bunch of suits, like pre-made suits in the English fashion from a tailor over there. And he decides, I'm going to go back to Philadelphia and sell all these suits and make a pretty penny. So he does just that. When he goes back to London now, his father has recently passed away. So he needs to settle the estate. He receives a significant inheritance from his father. Much of that he spends on these suits, back in London. He kind of lives it up for a few months. And then he returns to Philadelphia with this plan. 1754. And it's amazing because it took, many, many weeks to sail between these places at the time. This is, by the way, an image of Philadelphia in the 1750s, taken from Camden. He returns to Philadelphia with a number of gingerbread prints, and that is in the biography that I'll refer to in the future. A fantastic biography was written about Ludwig upon the year of his death in 1801 by Benjamin Rush, the eminent colonial physician. And it is available online. You can download it on Google. It's a fantastic first-hand account. And Rush actually Rush knew him quite well and went around interviewing people that Ludwig knew about his whole life story. So that's where a lot of this history comes from. Anyway, he comes back to Philly, and I think in the back of his mind, he knew that he was going to be a baker. While he was in London, he worked at some baking shops where he learned confectionery art, right? So this is a difference between being a bread baker and being a confectioner or a confectionery baker. It's the difference between being a pewtersmith and a goldsmith. It was a different status, a different level of income, and I think Ludwig saw that there was nobody in Philadelphia catering to this burgeoning economy and the wealthy patrons that were walking around in Philadelphia, and that he was selling these fancy suits to. So I believe he had a plan, and bringing his gingerbread prints. These were called prints at the time. They're not necessarily called molds. The other word that is used in contemporary literature is gingerbread board, and it is, in fact, they're carved out of boards, pieces of wood. We will return to this image a little bit later, but this is indeed the one of the prints that Ludwig brought back and is now in the collection of the Museum of the American Revolution, which is kind of an astonishing thing. The print is about this big, and it makes 2 cookies, as many of these boards did. Some other examples. These are not ones that Ludwig brought back, but these are examples in our collection, and so you're welcome to come take a look. I'll just mention for a moment, I'll put Ludwig off to the side and just say that gingerbread cookie baking in Europe at the time was a high art. Sugar was still quite expensive. Ginger, pepper, these are things that we had to import from the East. And Ludwig would have been very familiar from the triangle trade route of how you got the ingredients for gingerbread. I mean, they put all kinds of stuff into gingerbread. Beer, wine, different kinds of sugar, probably tea. Just about anything you can think of was put into gingerbread cookies. And that's why sometimes they're called spice cookies. The gingerbread art flourished in Central Europe. Holland, Belgium, France, Germany, the Germanic countries for sure. And it sort of reached a pinnacle in Nuremberg, where the bakers were buying honey from the surrounding beekeepers in or around the forest around Nuremberg, and making these cookies that were known as honey cakes. So a lot of this early cookie baking, when they couldn't access sugar, which was of course all being imported from either Asia or the Caribbean, they were using the local sweetener, which was honey. And in Nuremberg, trade was quite sophisticated. Some of the gingerbread bakers collaborated with the goldsmiths to create gold edible paint that they would paint on these cookies. So it really did sort of reach this level of being almost an edible jewel, and of course you could charge whatever you wanted to, especially to the new wealthy. An example of how serious they were about gingerbread are these huge cookie boards from the early 19th century. And these were known as parade boards, and confectioners would make these extremely fancy cookies. Cookie doesn't even seem like the right word for it. It's a tour de force. And they put them in the windows as an advertisement of their skill and what they could do. And I've read that during a lot of parades, particularly around the New Year, around the holidays, and during the winter solstice, the confectioners would actually carry these around as a symbol of their art. Not unlike what seems like the lowly pretzel when you compare something like this. And of course, the wood carvers from the Black Forest and that whole area of southern Germany and the Alps in Switzerland were very good at turning local woods into beautiful kitchen equipment, as it were. All right, so back to Ludwig. He comes back to Philadelphia and immediately settles on Letitia Court. Does anyone know what that is?
South Market.
Yep, Second to Market. Right there is the Franklin Fountain, right there. This is 2nd Street. Here's the head house. So the market, this is the old Quaker meeting before they grow and go to 4th and Arch. Here's Christ Church. And this map is about 1760. This is Church Street. And the architecture at that time was characterized by small, square-like buildings. There is a building on Market Street that sits right here that was built in the 1770s. It's 20 by 25. Most of the loft buildings, like Chain Confectionery built in the 1860s or the Franklin Fountain, are narrow and super long. And that's a 19th century development. But during the colonial period, this is how these buildings looked. And they often had these little courtyards where the horses and the carriages and other equipment that would service the back of house, so to speak, for these commercial operations. Letitia Court became Letitia Street in the 1850s when they connected and blew through all of this all the way to Chestnut Street to the south. So we know that Ludwig bought a property there and set up his bakery shop and was living above the shop for quite a few years. Amazingly, we have some early photographs of 18th century buildings that Ludwig would have seen on Letitia Court. Does anyone know what happened to this building? Do you? Exactly. This place was thought to be an early residence of William Penn. And there were folks who owned this in the middle 19th century that claimed it was the Penn House and would charge admission. And the wampum belt that's in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania was actually exhibited in this house. So for a nickel or whatever, a half dime, you would be able to tour what they were claiming to be the Penn House. And this went on until the 1880s when these big loft buildings started to take over the neighborhood. And some preservationists got some money together and they moved this to Fairmount Park. It's right across Girard Avenue from the Philadelphia Zoo. Scholars later have completely debunked the myth. It was built in the 1720s, well after William Penn was passed on. Penn's daughter, Letitia, is the reason the court is named Letitia, but she never lived here in Philadelphia. She came once, she didn't like it. It was sort of dirty to her London eyes. And of course, the William Penn Hotel is right next door. So I like to think that Ludwick went into this building. He certainly knew the shopkeeper that owned it. We're not sure exactly where Ludwick operated, but one account says that it was at the market. So it may have truly been the corner where Franklin Fountain is, or a neighbor across, but it probably was in a prominent location, especially because, as you'll see, this business became a raging success. This is another view of it. I learned that this is the west side of Letitia Street, so I believe that is Black Horse Alley, and that's Chestnut Street down that way. Just another interesting view of this building. Also on the block was a chocolate maker working at the same time as Christopher Ludwick and Benjamin Jackson. And Jackson had taken what was the governor's mill in Northern Liberties, started by William Penn, to grind spices and mustard and chocolate, and he acquired that business venture. It was one of Penn's failed business ventures in Philadelphia, and started making chocolate bars like this and mustard, which actually taste pretty good together, in my opinion. Some don't agree with me, but it was a stone ground chocolate, and this was one of the first commercial chocolate enterprises, definitely in Philadelphia, but in colonial America. And this is from a 1757 advertisement. So Jackson and Ludwick were contemporaries, and they've got this little sweet block both on Letitia Court, and this is of course the Penn family seal that they were carrying on the Penn tradition of chocolate making. Anyway, this is a chocolate bar that we make now at Shane's in the 18th century style, and it's my favorite bar. It's very rustic, so if you like chocolate, we have some in the back. So back to Ludwick. There are quite a few shop receipts, as Maria mentioned. We encourage you to come and take a look at the vitrines when the talk's over. There's a lot of records at the Historical Society, and these are some of his receipts. He did marry a woman named Catherine England. They had a child that died at childbirth, so he had no living children for most of his life. And this details some of the baked goods that he was selling to some pretty fancy people at the time. He was known as the governor of Letitia Court. In contemporary accounts, he lived there above his shop for 20 years, he and his wife. Became a naturalized Englishman in 1763, and then he founds this fine institution, along with others, and serves as the vice president in 1764. These are just some highlights of what he did. He was involved in so much. This presentation could go on twice as long. I mean, truly incredible. He was on so many committees. He was involved in civic affairs. He was involved in politics. He was involved in the Lutheran Church. He, within 20 years of his starting the confectionery bakery, he owns 9 houses in Philadelphia, a 32-acre farm in Germantown, and 123 acres in Lancaster County. I think 20 years into the business, he's in his 50s, and he's probably sick of living above his little bake shop. So he moves to what seems to be a palatial lot at 4th and Race. They actually rent the lot, he and his wife. And the size of it in the account of his will is quite substantial. So he's still living in Philadelphia, and he invests in this company to promote American manufacturers. This is where he meets Benjamin Rush, and Rush is really head of this group. And we're trying to get away from buying English-made goods. The revolution is percolating, and Ludwick is firmly on the side of being an American manufacturer. In fact, he is now an American. He's decided that 10 years before. So he invests a sizable amount into this company that dissolves in 1777 when the British take over Philadelphia following the Brandywine Campaign. If you talk about the revolution in Philadelphia, he is there. He's there with all of the major players, the founding fathers. He knows Benjamin Franklin. He knows Thomas Paine. He knows Washington. In Washington, become fast friends, and he becomes part of the Committee of Correspondence, which was sort of the precursor to the Continental Congress. Then, a year later, he's asked to vet decisions that the Continental Congress makes. Of course, they met in Carpenter's Hall before Independence Hall, at least for the first Continental Congress. And then there's, as the war kind of gets started in New England, the alarm cries go out in Philadelphia, and Ludwick immediately jumps into the fray and says, I'm gonna put money into this to raise. So he plunks down thousands of pounds for gunpowder and weapons. And there's some great quotes in this book about. I'm going to find this one. All right. He's quoted when he's being asked about his commission for baking by the Continental Congress, saying that they proposed that every pound of flour he should furnish the army with a pound of bread. No, gentlemen, I will not accept of your commission upon any such terms. Christopher Ludwick does not want to get rich by the war. He has money enough. I will furnish 135 pounds of bread for every something weight of flour you put into my hands. So he's basically saying, I'm giving you a wholesale discount. I'm not making a dime on this. I'm doing this because this is the way that I can contribute to the effort. He enlisted in the Continental Army. He goes back to being a soldier. He's got a ton of experience doing that. And he goes up to Brooklyn to help Washington and get the army out of that mess that we were nearly destroyed in New York and at the Battle of Brooklyn. This is the plaque outside, which when I walked in, Daphne and I were looking at these beautiful bronze plaque, and there it is, down the stairs when you enter, 1801. So this was for the founders, the early of the Dominion Society. So following the Brooklyn campaign, Washington escapes into New Jersey, and they come up with this crazy plan to attack the British Army, which was, this part of Trenton was mostly Hessian. And so in the middle of the night on Christmas, Washington's army goes into Trenton and they surprise the Hessians and round up a big number of them. Christopher Ludwick immediately becomes the emissary for the Continental Army to the Hessian soldiers. He speaks to them. He's a man of military experience. Not only he's an experienced guy too. I mean, he's in his 50s, and Washington at this point is relying on him to help communication. So there's an account where he takes 8 of these Hessians and takes them back a prisoner to Germantown, and he shows them around what a great life that one can lead here in America if you just break free of that rotten King George. And his life is here to prove it, right? He's come over, after being a military man, he's come over, he's sold some clothes, and kind of worked his way up, and has created quite a nice little empire of real estate and bakery trade based on his own merit, based on the opportunity that was here in Philadelphia. So he really is credited with a lot of the Germans that were captured after these battles staying in Pennsylvania and not returning. Of course, they're hired soldiers, so a lot of them don't have that much of an allegiance to Great Britain in the first place. In 1777, his experience is noted by others, including the Continental Congress and General Washington, and he's appointed Superintendent of Bakers, Director of Baking in the Grand Army of the United States. So this is basically a commission to be a general. And in fact, he was known as the Baker General by his men and by those who knew him during his lifetime. This is kind of interesting. I found this 1778, where they're raising a company of bakers to consist of 60 bakers with 12 foremen, 3 sub-directors, and 1 director, which shows that the director, who's the head honcho, makes $50 a month and 3 rations a day. Sort of ironic that the bakers didn't eat more than once a day. And then all the way down to the lowly bakers who were making about half of that. These are the recreated bake ovens at Valley Forge. And Ludwig was at Valley Forge, and it's felt that his ability to bake bread for the Army was one of the things that helped get us through that winter of 1777-78. In fact, Eric and I have an ancestor that was at Valley Forge with the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment. His name was Peter Grund. He was a Pennsylvania German from Chester County. And I like to think that Grund knew about Ludwig and ate some of his bread. And I think it probably happened. He didn't blush at charging General Washington for baked goods. A $2,500 baking bill for butter, milk, allspice, caraway seed, ginger, and he actually uses the word gingerbread, buttered biscuits and gingerbread. And as we know, Washington liked his sweets and would later lose his teeth part over his love of sweets, but Washington owned a couple of ice cream makers that he had at Mount Vernon that were in his will. And now we know that he liked gingerbread too. Surrender of Yorktown. So Ludwig is with Washington from Brooklyn, Battle of Long Island, all the way until Yorktown. He's in all the campaigns. Big celebration at Yorktown. The French over here representing, coming to our side in the white flag of surrender. And Cornwallis actually wasn't at the surrender ceremony there, but Washington says, no, we can't go home yet, Ludwig. We need you to bake bread for everybody. We're going to have a big party. So he baked 6,000 pounds of bread by order of General Washington in a matter of like a couple of days. And it's not clear whether he gave some of that bread to the British as well as a kind of a send-off gift, but he supplied the entire Continental Army and the entire French Army and Navy that was anchored in the port at Newport News. So I'll just stop there for a minute to say that after the Revolutionary War, Ludwig came home, and like many colonists who were fighting many of the Patriots, their estate was in shambles. The British had raped and pillaged the countryside. Ludwig had lost a ton of livestock. Some of his buildings were in complete ruin. And like many, he went to the Continental Congress and said, look, I've lost almost everything. He had his real estate, but everything that he had built up for the last 20 years was looking pretty bad. So he spent the next 5 years campaigning to get money. He ended up getting about 2,000 pounds for his efforts, which was really a small fraction of what he probably was due. But the Continental Congress had just paid for this war, and they didn't have that kind of money to pass around. And there were other people like Ludwig too, who had, Robert Morris, many others who had kind of given it all. So Ludwig has a backer in General Washington, and there's correspondence between them. Ludwig is known to have dined with the Washingtons, and my sense of it is that they were men of similar stature. They were born about 10 years apart, so Washington was the younger. But I get the sense that Ludwig was a large man. He certainly has this larger-than-life reputation. And he writes Washington asking for compensation if he can help. And Washington sends him a letter. I have known Christopher Ludwig from an early period in the war and have every reason to believe, as well from observation as information, that he has been a true and faithful servant to the public, that he has detected and exposed many impositions which were attempted to be practiced by others in his department, that he has been the cause of much saving in many respects, that his department in public life has afforded unquestionable proofs of his integrity and worth. With respect to his losses, I have no personal knowledge, but I have often heard that he has suffered from his zeal in the cause of his country. George Washington, April 25th, 1780. Ludwig, he did get some money back. He was very proud of the certificate and framed it and put it on his wall. And I'm not sure if that survives today, but it's a nice testimonial from the Commander-in-Chief, for sure. In 1795, Ludwig buries his wife, by that point, he's growing to be an older man. He helps out with the yellow fever epidemic and bakes bread to help a lot of the victims and some of the relief workers. And in 1801, he passes from this earth. He is buried under this substantial stone at St. Michael's Lutheran Churchyard in Germantown. And it's quite a summary. In memory of Christopher Ludwick and his wife Catherine, she died at Germantown the 21st September 1796, aged 80 years, 5 months. He died at Philadelphia the 17th of June, 1801, aged 80 years and 9 months. He was born at Gießen in Hesse-Darmstadt in Germany and learned the baker's trade and business. In his early life, he was a soldier and a sailor and visited the East and West Indies. In the year 1775, that is a mistake, he came to and settled at Philadelphia, and by the industry at his trade and business, acquired a handsome competency, part of which he devoted to the service of his adopted country in the contest for the independence of America. Was appointed Baker General to the Army, and for his faithful services received a written testimonial from the Commander-in-Chief, General Washington. On every occasion, his zeal for the relief of the oppressed was manifest, and by his last will he bequeathed the greater part of his estate for the education of the children of the poor of all denominations, gratis. He lived and died, respected for his integrity and public spirit by all who knew him. Reader, such was Ludwick. Art thou poor? Venerate his character. Art thou rich? Imitate his example. And indeed, Ludwig's estate of around £3,000 was given to aid poor folks that would like an education. And the Christopher Ludwick Foundation exists today and is alive and well. And we have a representative here tonight. And where is she? Yes. And the secretary of the Christopher Ludwick Foundation is here. So if you'd like to learn more about that group, is it Trina?
Yes.
Yes, we'd be happy to talk to you. And they do wonderful work and are based in Bryn Mawr. Is that correct?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia? Okay. Sort of a fun, this is probably the best illustration of Ludwick we have. There's an example of this wonderful children's book that was written a few years ago here about his story and the 6,000 pounds of bread baked. And of course, Christopher Ludwick lives on Letitia Court at the Franklin Fountain and Shane's, where Daphne and her team of confectioners have recreated the mold at the Revolutionary Museum and made these cookies to exact scale. So if you'd like, we have them here tonight. Thank you, and auf Wiedersehen.
The account books that you mentioned, you had some samples on the one slide.
Yes.
Where did you say they were? They are from?
I believe they're Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you.
I found them on an online digital archive where there's a group of different things. And this is actually the signature. Kind of interesting. Here, he goes by Christoph. That's in German. And then here's his name gets sort of anglicized over time, where he's now Christopher Ludwick in a lot of accounts.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Sorry.
Sure.
You noted that in 1776 he went up to New York and ended up assisting in the Battle of Long Island. Was he a baker at that point, or was he holding another position?
It seems like he enlisted in the army.
Okay.
He went and was like, I want to help out. My sense of it is, without really combing deeply, was that pretty immediately his skills were realized. And he of course would have been in his 50s at that point, so carrying a gun may not have been exactly what he wanted.
Well, but he had such zeal.
He lost an eye, too, during, I forgot to mention that, but during an accident, a baking accident, he did lose his left eye during the war. Yes.
Do you know if the wife kept the bakery going while he was away?
Yes, she did. She attended to all of his the properties, kept the farm going in Germantown, and my sense of what he was doing in Lancaster is he was speculating in that far off western county, and a lot of the Germans that were captured during the Philadelphia campaign were sent out to Lancaster. So I'm not sure if they were sent to Ludwig's farm or somewhere else. I mean, there could be a lot more research done about it.
They know the house where they sent the Quakers.
They do?
Yeah.
Really? Where,
It's part of the, I think, the historical society.
Okay. Great.
Yep, because I don't know the accurate answer.
That's great. Thank you. Yes?
So he rebuilt his fortune just through the same businesses he had.
He did.
Add any new businesses after the war.
It seems like that. It sounds like he started selling off real estate, I think, to kind of get back to where he was. I think he realized when he came back from the war that, he wasn't quite the youth of 30 when he arrived in Philadelphia. So he started selling some of the property off. And downsizing to the point where I think they just owned one property by the time he died. Yes?
You showed two different kinds of molds. The ones that you have here are negatives, but there were a couple that you showed that are positives. Were they matrices for making the molds? How does that work?
They are positives. The positives are the cookies. These, you mean?
No, but
No,
there were
the
some molds that
side
you
shots.
showed further
They have to leave
further
those
back.
back at the beginning.
They were much more elaborate. There you go.
There.
They're all carbon relief. These ones. The relief is not as deep on some of them. So, like this one here, which I'm holding, is very subtle. This is almost more like a Springerling board. And as Daphne and I were learning about the way gingerbreads were made at the time, the flour was the yeast and stuff were left to leaven for months. They didn't have, baking powder. So
Didn't they use potash and
No,
transform salt?
I believe they did.
not yet.
Oh,
Not yet.
no?
Nope.
When did that come in?
Late 18th, early 19th century.
Okay.
They're showing
Potash.
Hirshhorn salts.
I'm sorry?
Hirshhorn salts was
I thought that was earlier.
Not quite yet.
Not yet.
No. You got a couple of bakers, historic bakers.
Powdered horns are the bad leader.
I don't know this.
You're not a baker.
I'm not a baker.
It's still called that.
Oh, I see.
The cookies, the earliest cookies were different. Let's say they would have been denser and probably fairly hard. I mean, these were almost things that you might not even want to eat. They're little sculptures, and a lot of them would have been hand painted. So, and the level of the detail on the early molds is very different than what came later. These are 18th century. This is Napoleonic era, and then some of these other ones are more like mid-19th century. And then of course everything got kind of blander, let's say, as far as the carving. But for the most part, all the molds were carved in relief to produce a positive cookie, from what I understand. And this is sort of interesting. This looks more like you think of it, Pennsylvania German tulip. This is a German mold. And of course that stylized form comes from Germany. Yes?
The receipt that you had that he sent to Washington for the ingredients, where did that source come
I
from?
believe that's historical.
So that's also
That's part of that same
Okay.
archive. If you email me, Ryan at Franklin Fountain, I'd be happy to send you the link.
Okay. And one other question. We know, where the bakery was and then the chocolate factory kind of in the same vicinity. Do we know who else is working in those buildings? Do we know anything else? Like I know it's common in the Northeast for the chocolate factories to be basically, it's slave labor. Do we know anything about who else is working in either of these businesses?
No, the chocolate shop was a retail outpost for Jackson. The actual manufacture of the chocolate was happening in Northern Liberties at what was called the Globe Mills. So Penn started this mill during his lifetime, and it was called the Governor's Mill, of course, for the royal governor. And then after he passes on and his widow is dispersing the estate, it's sold off. And this fellow, Jackson, somewhere along the line buys it. There's a lot about Benjamin Jackson, where he's buying the mill, he's selling it, he's buying it back. But all through the 1750s and 60s, Jackson is living and operating on Letitia Court, right at the same time that Ludwick is there. As far as slave labor at the mill, I don't know, that would be very interesting to learn about that. Ludwick himself was anti-slavery from his writings. And I think he had seen a lot on his voyages. If you read this thing by Benjamin Rush, he talks about some of that, those atrocities. All right.
Did you know when you bought, that was, did you already know about that?
No.
That was all later.
No, I mean, I don't know when we learned. My brother Eric's in the back there.
Hi, Eric.
Looking at Eric because I don't remember when we learned about this man, but it was long after we had opened the Franklin Fountain, and it was like, what? He worked right here? And then this thing about this Benjamin Jackson.
Yeah.
I mean, it's well documented.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot about it, and it was just kind of an amazing coincidence. So I think we feel, in a similar way, channeling Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's print shop was directly across the street from Ludwig's shop. Franklin printed where the subway terminal is on the north side of Market Street, not on Market between 3rd and 4th. Yes, that was his grandson's shop, and Franklin's home was behind him. But Franklin's shop was at 2nd and Market. And so Ludwig, would have known. Deborah Franklin sold chocolate in that shop. That's documented. So whether that was Benjamin Jackson's chocolate, Jackson advertised this advertisement. He here is in the Pennsylvania Gazette from 1757. So Franklin was printing this fantastic illustration. And interestingly enough, we believe this is the chocolate bar. This is the mustard for sure. And if you really read this, it talks about the mustard seed was sold in little jars. So when we made the mold, one of our in-house artists blew this woodcut up to like this big and hand carved the positive and replicated it so that the chocolate bar would look. We got real deep down on this one. But we wanted it to look like an 18th century chocolate bar would have looked like. And we don't really know what that would have looked like, but this is probably more like a cake.
Cake is the right word.
Yes.
The word chocolate bar did not come in until the 19th century. Chocolate was sold as cakes.
Cakes.
So,
And you didn't eat it.
you did not.
For cooking, for baking, for... Do you have a sense of how big that would have been? Like, is this a pound of chocolate?
Yes, pound and half pounds.
Okay, so it's sizable.
Yeah,
As
I've
big
done a
as a
lot of
chocolate
research in chocolate.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
We need your contact.
I share.
I make chocolate at Colonial Williamsburg.
Oh, really? How wonderful.
We're a frightening team, I'm sorry.
Glad you're here. You're answering a lot of questions.
So this is great that just works out this way, that you learn something, we have learned a lot. And now we only have to come up with an idea, for a third of it. We have to dig into the archives again and see what else we can come up with.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we have to try the actual product.
Yes, well, thank you all for